The convoy rolled to a stop somewhere in the French countryside, early spring of 1945. Dust hung in the air, kicked up by tires that had traveled roads pockmarked by artillery and rain. Inside the transport truck, 5 German medical officers sat in silence, their field gray uniforms stained with mud and dried blood. They were prisoners now, captured during the Rhine crossing, but their war had been fought with scalpels and sutures, not rifles. One of them, Oberarzt Friedrich Weber, a surgeon from Hamburg, glanced through the canvas opening as American MPs gestured for them to disembark. His first thought was that this would be another humiliation. Another interrogation room with bare walls and suspicious eyes. But the GI at the tailgate spoke in broken German, almost apologetic. "You'll be working here. Medical duty. Follow me." They walked in formation, boots crunching on gravel, past rows of olive drab trucks and supply crates stenciled with U.S. Army markings. Then they saw it, a cluster of large tents arranged in neat rows, connected by wooden walkways. The canvas walls bore red crosses, bright against the drab landscape. From inside, they could hear the low hum of machinery, voices speaking in calm, measured tones, and the rhythmic beeping of something mechanical. Weber exchanged a glance with his colleague, Dr. Klaus Hartmann, an anesthesiologist who had worked in Berlin before the war. Neither spoke, but both understood. This was not what they expected. For months, they had operated in cellars and bombed-out schoolhouses, scavenging bandages from civilian clothing, boiling instruments in dented pots over wood fires. Their hospitals smelled of gangrene and desperation. Morphine was a memory. Penicillin was a rumor. They had learned to amputate without anesthesia, to close wounds with whatever thread they could find, to pray that infection wouldn't claim another young soldier before dawn. And now, standing outside this American field hospital, they heard something they hadn't heard in years, the sound of order. An American captain approached, a medical insignia on his collar. He was young, clean-shaven, and carried a clipboard as if this were a university hospital, not a battlefield. "Gentlemen," he said in passable German, "welcome. We could use experienced hands. You'll be treating your own wounded alongside ours. Any questions?" Weber wanted to ask 1,000 things. Instead, he simply nodded. The captain smiled, just barely. "Good. Let me show you the facility." As they approached the entrance, Weber noticed the tent flaps were tied back with precision, revealing a glimpse of the interior. Light electric light glowed from inside. The air smelled of disinfectant, sharp and clean. And in that moment, just before crossing the threshold, Friedrich Weber felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt afraid to hope. To understand what these German doctors were about to witness, you must first understand what they had left behind. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht's medical corps was a skeleton of its former self. Once a proud institution with research hospitals and mobile surgical units that rivaled any in Europe, it had been bled dry by 6 years of total war. The Eastern Front had consumed entire divisions of medics and nurses. Allied bombing had destroyed pharmaceutical factories, supply depots, and training academies. What remained was improvisation held together by exhausted hands. German field surgeons operated in conditions that would have been unthinkable in 1939. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Sulfonamide drugs, once abundant, were now reserved only for officers or the politically connected. Anesthesia often meant a leather strap between the teeth and a shot of schnapps if you were lucky. Sterilization was theoretical. Infection was assumed. Dr. Hartmann had once told Weber, during a bitter night in the Ardennes, that he felt like a medieval barber surgeon, not a physician. "We cut, we pray, we bury," he'd said. "That's all we do now." Meanwhile, across the ocean, American industry had been preparing for a different kind of war. While German factories struggled to produce enough bandages, American companies like Johnson & Johnson were churning out millions of sterile dressings in assembly lines that ran 24 hours a day. While German doctors hoarded penicillin like gold, American pharmaceutical plants were producing 2 million doses per month by 1944. The U.S. didn't just supply its military, it supplied its allies, too. British, French, and Soviet hospitals all benefited from American medical surplus. But the true difference wasn't just quantity. It was philosophy. The United States had approached battlefield medicine as an engineering problem. Every piece of equipment was standardized, mass-produced, and designed for rapid deployment. A field hospital in Normandy had the same setup as one in the Philippines. Surgeons could move between units and find instruments in the exact same drawer, in the exact same configuration. Supplies were packaged in waterproof containers and labeled with military precision. Even the tents themselves were engineered modular, insulated, with built-in ventilation and electrical wiring. This was logistics as doctrine. This was medicine as mass production. The German doctors knew none of this yet. They knew only their own reality, the endless shortages, the impossible choices, the letters from home describing hospitals without heat, without glass for windows, without hope. So when the American captain held open the tent flap and gestured for them to enter, what they were really crossing wasn't just a threshold of canvas and rope. They were crossing into a different world entirely, one built not on sacrifice and suffering, but on systems and abundance. And that world was about to change everything they thought they knew about war. The first thing that struck Weber was the light. Not the weak, flickering glow of kerosene lamps or candles melting into pools of wax, but clean, steady electric light that filled every corner of the tent. Bulbs hung from the canvas ceiling and metal fixtures, casting a surgical brightness that made everything visible, no shadows, no guesswork, no squinting over arterial bleeds. The second thing was the smell. It wasn't the stench of rot and unwashed bodies that had become the signature of every German aid station. Instead, the air smelled aggressively sterile, almost chemical. Phenol. Alcohol. Something else he couldn't immediately identify. Later he would learn it was the scent of industrial disinfectant, shipped in drums and sprayed liberally across every surface. And then there was the sound. A soft, rhythmic hissing came from somewhere to his left. Weber turned and saw a metal cylinder the size of a beer keg, connected to tubes and gauges. Oxygen, he realized. Portable oxygen. His breath caught. In Germany, oxygen cylinders were artifacts of peacetime hospitals, luxuries that had vanished years ago. Here, they stood casually in the corner like firewood. The American captain led them deeper inside, past rows of hospital beds, real beds, with metal frames and clean white sheets, not straw mattresses on the floor. Patients lay in them, some sleeping, some reading letters, some smoking cigarettes. An American medic moved between them, checking pulses, adjusting 4 drips that hung from collapsible stands. 4 drips. Plural. Weber stopped walking. He stared at the clear bags suspended above the beds, each one feeding saline or plasma directly into a soldier's veins. In his last field hospital, they'd had 2 4 bottles for an entire battalion. 2. And those had been glass, fragile, impossible to transport safely. These were flexible, durable, and there were dozens of them. Hartmann leaned close and whispered in German, "This is a dream. We're dead, and this is a dream." But it wasn't. The captain gestured toward a side table near the surgical area, where instruments lay arranged in perfect order on sterilized trays. Weber approached slowly, as if the tools might vanish if he moved too quickly. He saw scalpels with disposable blades, retractors in 3 different sizes, hemostats that gleamed under the lights. Everything was polished, organized, and most impossibly abundant. There were duplicates. Backups. Extra sets still sealed in waxed paper. And then he saw the machine. It sat on a wheeled cart, compact and angular, with dials and a viewing screen. Weber had seen X-ray equipment before, massive, stationary devices that required their own buildings and dedicated electrical generators. This one was the size of a suitcase. Portable radiography, the captain said, noticing Weber's stare. "We can move it anywhere. Set it up in 15 minutes. Get images in the field." Weber didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was reeling, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew about war, about scarcity, about the brutal mathematics of medicine under fire. One of the younger German doctors, a lieutenant named Becker, finally spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. "How?" The American captain smiled, but there was no arrogance in it. Just a simple, matter-of-fact answer. Factories. The truth was both simpler and more staggering than any of them imagined. What the German doctors were witnessing wasn't a special hospital, reserved for high-ranking officers or VIP casualties. This was standard. Every U.S. field hospital from Normandy to the Pacific operated at roughly this level. The equipment, the organization, the supplies, all of it was replicated thousands of times across every theater of war. American industry had turned battlefield medicine into an assembly line. Take the portable sterilizer sitting quietly in the corner. In Germany, sterilization meant boiling instruments in makeshift pots, hoping the water was hot enough, long enough. Infection rates were catastrophic. But this American device, no bigger than a footlocker, used pressurized steam and precise temperature controls to sterilize surgical tools in minutes. It was manufactured by a company in Ohio that had been making pressure cookers before the war. They retooled, scaled up, and by 1944, they were producing 500 units per month. Or consider the anesthesia machine. Hartmann stood before it like a pilgrim at a shrine. It had regulators, flow meters, and separate chambers for oxygen and ether. In German hospitals, anesthesia was administered by dripping ether onto a cloth held over the patient's face, crude, dangerous, and often ineffective. This machine delivered precise concentrations, monitored breath by breath. A dentist's son from Michigan had designed it. It was now standard issue. The refrigeration unit was perhaps the most revolutionary piece of equipment in the tent. It hummed quietly, maintaining a constant 4 degrees Celsius. Inside were vials of penicillin, bottles of plasma, and packets of freeze-dried blood products. Blood banking, storing, transporting, and transfusing blood on a mass scale was an American innovation perfected during the war. The Red Cross had collected 13 million pints of blood from civilian donors, processed it into plasma, and shipped it worldwide in containers that could survive anything from desert heat to Arctic cold. Weber learned that plasma saved more lives than any other single medical advancement of the war. A soldier bleeding out in a foxhole could receive a transfusion within an hour. Not from a matching donor on site, but from a bottle carried in a medic's pack, donated months earlier by a factory worker in Pittsburgh or a housewife in Oregon. The blood of the home front, literally flowing into the veins of the front line. Even the lighting told a story. The bulbs overhead weren't powered by generators that roared and belched smoke. They ran on compact, reliable power units designed specifically for field use, quiet, efficient, and capable of running for days on a single fuel load. An electrical engineer from General Electric had spent 2 years perfecting them. They were now deployed in every mobile hospital the Army operated. But perhaps the most telling detail wasn't any single machine. It was the spare parts. In one corner, Weber saw wooden crates stacked neatly, labeled with alphanumeric codes. Inside were replacement components for every major piece of equipment: backup tubes, extra gauges, redundant switches. The Americans had anticipated failure and planned for it. Nothing was irreplaceable. Nothing was precious. Everything was expendable, because everything could be replaced. That was the key. That was the difference. Germany fought with what it had. America fought with what it could make. The surgery began without ceremony. An American soldier had been brought in an hour earlier, shrapnel wounds to the abdomen from a mortar round. Weber and Hartmann were invited to observe, standing at a respectful distance while the U.S. surgical team prepared. What they witnessed over the next 90 minutes was a masterclass in modern battlefield medicine. The patient was already under anesthesia, breathing steadily through a rubber mask connected to Hartmann's beloved machine. His skin had been prepped with iodine solution, the surgical field draped in sterile cloth. The lead surgeon, a major from Boston, worked with calm efficiency, his hands steady under the bright lights. But it wasn't the surgeon that impressed Weber most. It was the team. A nurse, a woman, Weber noted with surprise, managed the instrument tray with practiced precision. She handed over clamps, sutures, and retractors without being asked, anticipating each step of the procedure. Another medic monitored vital signs on a clipboard, calling out pulse and respiration every few minutes. A third stood ready with additional supplies, including packed gauze, extra ligatures, and vials of morphine. They moved like musicians in an orchestra, each playing their part in perfect synchronization. The surgery itself was methodical. The major located the shrapnel fragments with minimal exploratory cutting. He'd reviewed the portable X-ray images beforehand, something Weber had never had the luxury of doing. Each piece of metal was removed, each damaged vessel tied off, each layer of tissue closed with meticulous care. Halfway through, the nurse swabbed the wound with penicillin solution. Near the end, she administered a full injection of the antibiotic. Penicillin. Used liberally. Not rationed, not saved for the next patient. Just used. The procedure finished, and the patient was moved to recovery, still breathing easily under sedation. The major peeled off his gloves and turned to the German doctors. Questions? Weber hesitated, then asked in careful English, "How many surgeries do you perform here in one day?" "Depends on the fighting," the major said. "During the Rhine push, we did 23 in 18 hours. Lost 2 patients. One from shock, one from wounds too severe when he arrived. 23 surgeries. 2 deaths." Weber thought of his own record. 5 surgeries in a day was heroic. 10 was legendary. And his mortality rate hovered near 30%, even for routine procedures. Infection claimed most of them. The major must have read something in Weber's expression, because his tone softened. "We're fortunate," he said quietly. "We have what we need. That makes all the difference." Hartmann, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. "It's not fortune, Herr Major. It's something else." The American nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose it is." Over the following days, something unexpected happened. The German doctors were put to work not as prisoners performing menial labor, but as physicians. They treated wounded German POWs brought in from nearby camps, working alongside American staff in the same tents, using the same equipment, following the same protocols. At first, the interactions were formal, cautious. But medicine has a way of dissolving barriers. Weber found himself standing beside the Boston major during a particularly difficult case, a young Wehrmacht soldier with a crushed pelvis. The major worked the upper half of the injury while Weber handled the lower, their hands moving in synchrony, communicating through gesture and instinct rather than words. When they finished, the major offered Weber a cigarette. They smoked in silence, then began talking. Not about the war. Not about politics or ideology. About medicine. They discussed techniques for vascular repair. Weber described a suturing method he'd learned during his residency in Hamburg. The major shared a trick for reducing blood loss during amputations, something he'd picked up from a British surgeon in North Africa. Hartmann joined them, and soon they were debating the optimal ether concentration for abdominal surgery, sketching diagrams on scrap paper, laughing at shared frustrations with stubborn infections and uncooperative anatomy. The barriers fell faster than anyone expected. An American nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison from Iowa, taught young Dr. Becker how to properly administer plasma transfusions using the new vacuum-sealed bottles. Becker, in turn, showed her a German technique for immobilizing fractures using minimal materials, a skill born from years of scarcity. She took notes. He blushed when she thanked him. In the evenings, after the last surgery, the doctors gathered around a portable stove where someone always seemed to be brewing coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute Weber had choked down for years. They swapped stories, compared medical schools, mourned colleagues lost. Politics was never mentioned. Rank was irrelevant. They were simply doctors, doing what doctors do. One night, the Boston major asked Weber about his family. Weber admitted he didn't know if his wife and daughters had survived the bombing of Hamburg. The major was quiet for a moment, then placed a hand on Weber's shoulder. "When this is over," he said, "we'll help you find out." Weber believed him. Years later, Weber would describe those weeks as the moment he stopped seeing enemies and started seeing colleagues again. The war hadn't ended, artillery still rumbled in the distance, but inside that field hospital, something else had. Humanity had returned. Late one evening, after the Americans had retired to their quarters, the German doctors gathered in the POW tent. Becker brewed ersatz tea from saved rations, and for the first time since their capture, they spoke freely. "They're not supermen," Hartmann said, staring into his cup. "That's what bothers me most. They're just competent. Well supplied. Organized." Weber nodded. "And we were told they were weak. Soft. That their mongrel society couldn't sustain a real war effort. The propaganda had been relentless. For years, Goebbels' machine had painted Americans as decadent, undisciplined, incapable of sacrifice. German newsreels mocked their jazz music, their Hollywood frivolity, their lack of martial spirit. The message was clear: the Americans might have factories, but they lacked the iron will of the Reich. And yet, the field hospital told a different story. It spoke of a nation that had mobilized its industrial might with terrifying efficiency, that had married mass production to medical science, that had created systems so robust they functioned flawlessly even in the chaos of war. This wasn't weakness. This was power of a kind Germany had never truly understood. "I kept waiting to see the cracks," Becker admitted quietly. "The shortages, the incompetence, the corruption. But everything works. Everything is available. It's as if they have infinite resources." "They do," said another doctor, Lieutenant Stein, who had been silent until now. "We were fighting a nation of 300 million people who hadn't been bombed, hadn't been starved, hadn't lost their factories. We were fighting a country that could produce more in a month than we could in a year." The room fell silent. Weber thought about the X-ray machine, the sterilizer, the oxygen tanks, the endless vials of penicillin. He thought about the spare parts in their labeled crates, the standardized equipment, the nurses who worked with confidence because they knew supplies would never run out. He thought about his own hospitals back home, cellars and ruins where he'd amputated limbs with rusty saws and prayed. "We were lied to," he said finally. Not with anger. Just exhaustion. Hartmann looked up. "About what?" "About winning." No one contradicted him. They sat in silence, drinking their tea, listening to the distant generators hum, feeling the weight of a revelation that came too late to matter. The war was almost over. They were prisoners. But somehow, in this American tent full of machines and medicine, they had never felt more free. The war ended 6 weeks later. By summer, Weber and his colleagues were processed through the POW repatriation system and sent home to a Germany that no longer existed. The cities were rubble. The hospitals were ruins. The medical infrastructure had been shattered so completely that rebuilding seemed impossible. But they carried something with them. Knowledge. Weber returned to Hamburg and found the university hospital where he had trained, where he had taught, reduced to a burned-out shell. But the basement was intact. He gathered a dozen surviving colleagues, cleared the debris, and began rebuilding. They had no equipment, no supplies, no funding. But they had seen what was possible. He implemented American triage protocols. He organized surgical teams along the efficient structures he'd observed in that French field hospital. When the first shipments of Marshall Plan medical aid arrived, American surplus, including familiar sterilizers and X-ray machines, he knew exactly how to use them. Hartmann went further. He wrote extensively about his experiences, publishing papers on American anesthesia techniques, equipment design, and infection control. His work influenced an entire generation of German physicians and helped reshape post-war medical education. He never forgot the machine that had captivated him, and he spent years advocating for its adoption in civilian hospitals across Europe. Even young Becker carried the lessons forward. He eventually immigrated to the United States, completed a residency in Chicago, and became a pioneering trauma surgeon. He credited his time in that POW field hospital as the moment he truly learned what medicine could be. The German doctors who witnessed American battlefield medicine in the spring of 1945 became ambassadors of a different kind of victory. They had lost the war, but they had gained something more valuable than territory or pride. They had seen a system that valued life over ideology, abundance over sacrifice, preparation over desperation. And in the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and Europe healed, those lessons spread like ripples across a pond. The machines that shocked them became standard. The techniques that amazed them became routine. The compassion that surprised them became expected. Sometimes, the most important battles aren't won with bombs or bullets. They're won with knowledge, generosity, and the simple revolutionary belief that every life, even an enemy's, is worth saving.